Well, it was a Merry Christmas indeed, and Santa Obama slipped a little gift under the tree for us this year. It is the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2017. I'm joined in studio now by David Knight to talk about this. David, what worries you the most about this little gift left from Barack Obama?
Well, what worries me the most, Owen, is that it isn't just Obama. This is something that the GOP has pushed very heavily for. This is something that has been developing for a number of years, going back to 2012, the NDAA Act then. Of course, the thing that was in everybody's attention at that point in time was the indefinite detention by the military without trial, without accusation. But there was also something else in that. And at the time, it was reported by Business Insider, by Michael Hastings, who has now been assassinated, I believe, by the American government, the intelligence services. They were pointing out that Congress was seeking to lift a ban on propaganda. At that time, they put into the NDAA something that would effectively nullify the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948, which they put in as a prohibition against propagandizing Americans. So in 2012, they stopped the prohibition of government being involved in propaganda. And we said at the time, InfoWars said CIA will now openly propagandize Americans. And now here we are, 4 years later, they have set up a structure to actively do that. So first, 4 years ago, they removed the ban. Now they have gone proactive and said, this is how we're going to do it. And they've funded it to the tune of $160 million for 2 years.
And what they actually did here was very sneaky, not just bringing it in on Christmas Eve. I guess, Barack Obama wanted to play Santa this year, but the original bill was H.R. 5181. A lot of people brought attention to this, but instead of actually passing that bill, what they did was they inserted it essentially the same thing or the same goals into the NDAA for fiscal year 2017, specifically Section 1287, the Global Engagement Center. Now, there's all kinds of nuts and bolts we want to get into there, but real quick, just to go back to the HR 5181, now what they did here was they had to change the name of this bill to Countering Foreign Propaganda Act. That's not the original name of this bill. That was a recent title change. And then you go and you look at the actual text. It mentions foreign governments, including the government of Russia, using disinformation and other propaganda tools to undermine the national security objectives of the United States. David, this seems like something that has been long in the works here.
Yeah, as we pointed out earlier, and you and I were on the radio show talking about this, there's been 100 years of propaganda from the American government. It was the American government that invented propaganda. It wasn't Goebbels. We had a good 20 years on them thanks to Edward Bernays and Woodrow Wilson, somebody that I think Obama resembles more than any other president because he's going to remain in Washington just like Woodrow Wilson did. He's a committed globalist just like Woodrow Wilson. But this is something that was developed in the United States. And as we talked about when we did that countering the InfoWars Act, because that's the way it started out, countering information warfare. Then they changed it to countering foreign. They've got to get that foreign in there, Owen, because that's the enemy that we got to be protected from. And then talking about propaganda, because nobody likes propaganda. But let's remember how the American government created this. And I find this whole thing about creating a global center under the direction of the State Department, I mean, that is absolutely Orwellian. Absolutely Orwellian.
And let's look at some of the text here. Let's disseminate some of this text. Now, we're going into Section 1287, the Global Engagement Center of the NDAA Act that Obama just passed. A2. The purpose of the center shall be to lead, synchronize, and coordinate efforts of the federal government to recognize, understand, expose, and counter foreign state and non-state propaganda and disinformation efforts aimed at undermining the United States national security interests. They completely ignore the DNC, completely ignore Hillary Clinton's private server. But the main word that sticks out to me, David, is non-state propaganda. Are they basically opening the doors to put out their own propaganda? They're admitting they want state propaganda to run it.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, and as if you look at it, what they're going to fund is they're going to fund private institutions to do this as well, just like we've seen non-governmental organizations used for Soros's color revolutions, used by the State Department abroad. These are the people who have created revolution throughout the world. These are people who have created regime change. We've seen how that's worked out in Libya. We've seen how that's worked out in Syria. We see what's happening in the former Soviet Union. They say this legislation will establish a fund to help train local journalists, provide grants and contracts to NGOs. These are the type of people that Soros has used in his color revolutions, civil society organizations, think tanks, private sector companies, media organizations, other experts outside the U.S. government. In other words, anybody that will push forward their propaganda war. And we have to remember that it was about 6 years ago that Cass Sunstein, and we talked about this earlier, was talking about the necessity to nudge us. Yeah, they didn't want to come at us directly. Instead, they wanted to develop a choice architecture where they could manipulate our choices by the information that they gave us. That is called propaganda. That's something that has been perfected by American advertising, thanks to Edward Bernays and others. And that is something that the American government prohibited previously, prior to the 2012 NDAA Act. They removed that prohibition. Now they have set up a structure to do this. I find it very concerning that this is being run by the State Department, one of the most anti-American, one of the organizations that has run revolutions throughout the world. Now they're bringing that revolution home. And as we heard from the founding fathers, they said the means of fighting tyranny abroad will be, of fighting wars abroad will be brought back as tyranny at home. And that's what is happening with this. It's the weaponization of this.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned some of the funding that's going to go out to implement this bill, but they use words like grant and foreign propaganda to basically justify having state-run media. I think that's the end goal here, David.
Absolutely. And it's also fitting, really, that they would put it in the NDAA, besides always putting in these Christmas gifts for us that people don't pay any attention to. If we go back to this original article from Business Insider, they've had a quote from Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who was very critical of this removal at the time. He said, look, we've seen this happen in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's information operations, IO. It states that after Desert Storm, he said, the military wanted to transform IO into a core military competency on par with air, ground, maritime, and special operations. And he talks about the various components of it: electronic warfare, computer network operations, psychological operations, military deception, operations security, in concert with specified supporting and related capabilities. In other words, he said they want to protect a key friendly center of gravity, that is, the U.S. national will, public opinion, by manipulating it, by repealing the prohibitions against propaganda. That's what's fundamentally involved here. That's why they're combining the State Department, that's experienced at overthrowing governments, along with the military and along with the Director of National Intelligence. That's what they're combining here: the CIA, the State Department, and the military, to weaponize information, a literal war on Americans.
And here's the proof. In this section, B10, it reads, they want to maintain, collect, use, and disseminate records. Such research and data analysis shall be reasonably tailored to meet the purposes of this paragraph. They are admitting it. In this bill, they want to cater and tailor the information that you get that suits their agenda. And then going on, B4, identify current and emerging trends in foreign propaganda, there's that word again, and disinformation in order to coordinate procedures to expose and refute foreign misinformation and disinformation, again, ignoring state or domestic misinformation and disinformation, to proactively promote fact-based narratives and policies to audiences outside the United States. It really is the most Orwellian bill I've ever seen. And you were mentioning this on the radio show. This is what InfoWars has been doing for 20 years, disseminating the propaganda, trying to cipher through all of it to find the reality and the truth. They want to take over that power, and they want to be controlled. They want to be the 1984 Orwellian state in charge of all information, David.
Yeah, we've been dissecting it. They've been the ones disseminating it, but we have to understand that how this is going to play out, Owen. We know that the government is going to be involved in setting up a new narrative and countering other information. And think about how that contradicts with the First Amendment. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. The whole purpose of this is to abridge freedom of the press. It is to tell you what they want you to think. It is to control your information, take away your freedom of choice in terms of being able to choose what you want to hear, and giving you the narrative that they have carefully constructed to create a quote-unquote choice architecture. That's not my term. That's Cass Sunstein's terms. And of course, engineering consent is the term that Bernays used going back 100 years. That's the purpose of all this, is to engineer consent to abridge freedom of press and freedom of speech. That's what this is all about.
And to me, this document opens the doors for them to do all of that and then justify it. In fact, you know what? This is propaganda, okay? This bill is propaganda. This bill is what this bill is meant to stop. But that's why we at InfoWars are here to stop it.